Welcome to Forthright Reader Feedback Edition. Last week's column, wherein I found points of common ground with both Leonard Pitts and Shawn Vestal, drew an unusually high volume of positive feedback from people who are tired of what my mom calls argy-bargy. That's an old British slang term for noisy arguments, and we certainly have a lot of them today. But of course it wasn't 100% agreement. I disagreed with Pitts on his diagnosis of the root cause of our partisan chasm, and there were a couple of persistent critics who objected to my characterization of the issue, but we'll get to that later. First, here is the column, as published April 14, 2022, in the Spokane Review, headlined by the editors, Americans Having a Hard Time Finding Common Ground These Days. Leonard Pitts used to be one of my favorite columnists. When he lectured to a full auditorium at Whitworth University well over a decade ago, he touched on many common themes in American life. But after November 2016, Pitts took a sharp turn to the left, and it's been hard to read his columns without eye-rolling. Then on Monday, he wrote exactly what I've been thinking. Quote, "We no longer share a narrative, we no longer have a common thread." End quote. He points out how we need more than the easy unity inspired when under direct threat, then continues, "What Americans have lost is the willingness and ability to share a common national identity." End quote. Pitts is right about the rally around the flag effect of Pearl Harbor in 1941 and the 9/11 attacks on New York City and Washington, D.C., but without a common enemy, we have turned on each other. That doesn't mean we should never disagree. As Shawn Vestal wrote in a 2018 column for Independence Day, open quote, "Civility is important, but sometimes dissent is more so. People will draw this line in different places, of course, but I doubt that anyone alive would disagree that there is such a line." End quote. Stop the presses. Madsen is in agreement with Pitts and Vestal, but not entirely. The full Pitts quote, without the ellipsis, was, "What Americans have lost, to be painfully accurate, what Republicans have trashed in pursuit of power, is the willingness and ability to share a common national identity." Pitts blamed the loss of common narrative on the loss of trust in mainstream news organizations by Republicans, clearly skeptical of all sources in the recent YouGov.com poll on trust in media. Republicans' trust in Fox News is barely over 50%, down slightly since 2020. No other news source ranks better than 41%. Democrats as a group are more trusting overall. They even increased their trust in Fox News by the same percentage it dropped among Republicans. "In God we trust" may be the official motto of the United States of America, but the conservative motto when it comes to news is trust but verify. Pitts may be pining for our shared childhood experience of Walter Cronkite setting the narrative on the nightly news. We're way beyond Edward R. Murrow's See It Now program telling us what we need to know. We see it now, or think we see it now, on videos posted to social media in real time from all over the world. CNN, NBC, and the Washington Post could have avoided settling multi-million-dollar lawsuits for defamation if they'd only remembered the old saying among journalists, "If your mother says she loves you, check it out." Instead, they bit on a single video, framed on Twitter, painting a white boy from Kentucky as a racist. It fit their narrative. Turned out instead to be a high school student put in an uncomfortable position by a man old enough to know better. The gap between what anyone with a smartphone can find out and what's reported on mainstream news was evident this morning listening to NPR. 2 stories on the Brooklyn subway attack. Be on the lookout for the suspect, and not once did they mention his race. Quoting the live stream police briefing, describing him as a dark-skinned man, or the AP story referring to him as black and posting black nationalist videos, seems to have been deemed racist instead of relevant to narrowing down the search. Now, instead of producers at 3 television networks and a handful of newspaper editors curating our news for us, thousands of sources are available to everyone to do their own fact-checking. Meanwhile, news streams are filtered by an army of algorithms feeding us what we want to hear or what the invisible programmers behind the curtains think we should hear. Skepticism is a rational response. It's not paranoia to wonder if big news has an agenda. So who do we trust? Pitts laments how, quote, "Americans no longer proceed from common baseline assumptions, are no longer driven by the same national aspirations, no longer understand the meaning and mission of their country in the same way." End quote. There is a solution, and it's not found by following the "America is irredeemably racist" is adopted as a mainstream narrative. The Founding Fathers, imperfect as they were, set high aspirations for the new country. Time to return to the motto of 1776, E pluribus unum, out of many, one. Teach all the history, recognizing flaws, but more importantly, celebrating progress and emphasizing opportunity instead of victimhood. Embrace the necessity of civil dissent on vital and fundamental issues instead of forcing a single narrative, progressive or conservative. And sing a song of hope. Recognize the value of little gestures as common threads, like standing for the flag and singing an impossibly pitched national anthem with old-fashioned words. It may be tattered, but it's our star-spangled banner. Does it still wave? Well, it's always fun to read comments from naysayers, but first, a sampling of the positive comments, many from self-admitted former Leonard Pitts fans. From Chan in Spokane, you are spot on. I used to look forward to his articles. Now I dread seeing his picture and reading the headline. I do disagree regarding when he took the left turn, though. I'm pretty sure it started in 2008, 2009 during Obama's first campaign and term, more specifically with the Trayvon Martin shooting. From Patty in Usk, I read the first couple of sentences of Mr. Pitt's column and usually decide not to go any farther. I did read the column you referenced and ended up shaking my head once again. How anyone can blame the lack of trust in news organizations is beyond me. The mainstream media has done such a poor job of reporting the actual news and or both sides or in an unbiased way, it is obvious they have no one but themselves to blame. From John in Colbert, thank you for saying what a great portion of the American population thinks and believes in these days in regard to the divisiveness that is currently ruling our society and culture. It's rather ironic that Mr. Pitts complains about this issue and the lack of stability while pointing out that only Republicans are generally suspicious of the news media. There was a Wall Street Journal a while ago that pointed out that within the past few years, most people, including other countries, have lost their faith in the government's, national and local, ability to govern their constituents, lost their faith in the education system to teach fairly without forcing a prescribed leftist agenda, lost their faith in law enforcement thanks to the defund the police insanity, lost their faith in the governmental healthcare industry with their never-ending flip-flopping on what the solutions are for the various illnesses that run throughout the population, and they're very disgusted with being labeled with the never-ending ists or icks, aka homophobic, misogynistic, racist, and on it goes ad nauseum, to the point where most people totally ignore those labels as meaningless. Thanks for listening. From 89-year-old Jack, in my view, your column today hit the national issue directly on the head, but the fact that 95% of the public are ignorant in the sense of the Latin root of ignorant, not knowing, most will continue to not know. What is needed is a free, unbiased press. Your editor, Rob Curley, once candidly told me that unfortunately there is no longer an unbiased press. I sadly agree with him. From Chris, I am a hardcore independent with some very conservative views and some very liberal views, and my Walter Cronkite is dead. Instead, I have a media that runs 10-minute segments on a mass subway shooting and never mentions the person's skin color, as it should be. Then the very next story is white cop shoots black man, and people take to the streets and protest without knowing what the real story was there, because the media has incited a racial riot. People called out by the color of their skin for political purposes. Right now, there is very little difference between CBS and the KKK, and that is why we are so divided. MLK dreamed that someday a person would be known by the content of their character, not the color of their skin. CBS and the KKK have killed that dream for now. Pitts is the worst kind of racist. At least the KKK is honest about its racism. Thanks for the great read. Would you like to run for president? I have no one else to vote for. Sorry, Chris, I am not running for president, but I sure hope we find candidates who are younger than 70 years old in 2024. From Melody, I am so pleased with the content of today's column. For one thing, I have to salute you for faithfully reading Pitts's columns. Like the trashy headlines at the grocery checkout magazines, I try not to allow my gaze to linger on his weekly headline. Somehow you've managed to make a silk purse out of a pig's ear. For another, it demonstrates a desire for goodwill from people of good faith. Do not grow weary in well-doing. Melody, guilty confession here. I've mostly given up on Pitts's columns, but a reader asked me to take a look at that one and it caught my attention. I do appreciate tips from readers. From Daniel, I love that you would wryly observe your agreement with Pitts and Vestal and that you would give a well-deserved jab to NPR for not mentioning a suspect's race when we're supposed to be on the lookout. I wish American conservatives tended to agree with your ideal, teach all the history, recognizing the flaws, embrace the necessity of civil dissent. Reminds me of a t-shirt I admired stating, America wouldn't need CRT if it was honest. Thanks again for your thoughts, your useful highlighting of inconsistencies, and your visible effort to get us less divided. Thanks, Daniel. I appreciate your feedback. On the naysayer's side, often the criticism is over the column the critic thinks I should have written instead of sticking to the column as published. From Terry, I agree with you on not forcing a single narrative, either conservative or progressive, but for me as a reader, you have to show that in your writing. Where is your example of criticism for someone like Fox News? Be consistent. So, Terry, if I was writing a comparative analysis of various news media, I would have included criticism of various news sources, but that wasn't the point. As for calling out NPR, I've been a steady listener since Morning Edition and All Things Considered went on the air for over 40 years, so I feel entitled to criticize. By the way, in order to properly criticize Fox News, I'd have to watch it, and I only see it when getting my tires changed. And I haven't seen CNN anywhere but airports in at least 10 years since we ditched television, so I'm in no position to criticize it either. Having to settle a defamation lawsuit, that was the news that I read. From Galen, with whom I've been trying to find common ground, but we've made no progress yet. You are as tribal as they come. This morning's column definitely showed that. You talked about the need to find common ground and even quoted Leonard, Pitts, and Shawn Vestal. But then when it came right down to it, you blamed everything on the Democrats. Pitts has taken a hard left since 2014? Really? Not only is that harmful to the search for common ground you claim to be searching for, but it also makes your columns a waste of time and space. There is zero nuance or thoughtfulness. Just a bunch of tribal cheerleader type of garbage. For that reason, I am going to stop reading your columns. They are a waste of time. Well, Galen, you're entitled to your opinion, and I certainly encourage you to spend your time how you want to. Democrats were only mentioned once in the column, and that's in the context of quoting the results of a nonpartisan poll on attitudes towards media. No one's forcing you to read, Galen, but I'll bet you take a peek. And I'll close with a kind of a long comment from Molly, who is looking for hope. I appreciated your article last week. Sadly, I fear that the great experiment of government by the people has already failed, and we're just not fully aware of it yet. Because that won't happen in a black and white manner, but rather with a slow demise. Though it's not official, we already are two separate countries, each with its own set of beliefs, media sources, and distrust of the other country. What you suggested is theoretically what we need, but one country would have to offer that approach and the other country would have to trust, in the face of attacks from that country's media and politicians, that it was a good course of action. I don't see how it happens. We even turned a virus into a fight. It would take a special leader on a Churchill-Lincoln scale to bring the country together, and I see no one with that sort of ability or, perhaps more importantly, mindset among our current politicians. I appreciate that Biden has tried to at least talk about unity, but he has nowhere near the sort of gravitas, ability, charisma, or probably credibility at this point to pull off any sort of unification. If you could talk me off the ledge on this one, I'd love to hear it. Okay, so let me try and talk you off that ledge, Molly. Let me read an excerpt from this book. See if you can guess what the incident is. Newspapers from both parties were gearing up for what they expected would be a bitter election campaign. Editors were quick to interpret the incident through the prism of politics and the interests of their region. In some cases, that was reflected in their early opinion pieces assessing blame for the incident. But by fall, the military campaign was cooling down as the election campaign was heating up. By September, the battle was 2 months old, and the bulk of the presidential campaign was yet to come. Party leaders and journalists had a decision to make. Was the Little Bighorn still the campaign issue, or had the country moved on? That's from Shooting Arrows and Slinging Mud, Custer, the Press, and the Little Bighorn by James Mueller. A few more things I learned from the book. The presidential campaign of 1876 was between Rutherford B. Hayes of Ohio, nominated for his proven ability to win tough elections in a battleground state, and Samuel J. Tilden of New York, a proven vote-getter with a reputation for attacking corruption and reforming government. In other words, two powerhouse politicians from key states were nominated for their electability, not necessarily their ability. Mueller quotes historians who describe the presidential campaigns of the 1870s and 1880s as intensely personal and nasty, and the 1876 Hayes-Tilden campaign as setting a new standard for nastiness. And yet it still only made number 16 on historian Kerwin Swint's list of the 25 nastiest presidential campaigns from 1776 to 2008. Now, the 2016 campaign was relatively tame compared to historical mudslinging. The nastiest of all time, according to most historians, included sex scandals, accusations of intended subversion of the Constitution, apocalyptic predictions of pensions going unpaid to homeless veterans, dismantling of the military, and charges that one candidate was not a Christian but an atheist who insults yourselves and your Bible. Can you guess the year? It was 1800. Our first attempt at a country as an election with the first political parties. We have seriously toned it down since then. I'll put a link to the Brookings Institution article on negative campaigns on the Substack intro and the video end card. None of us can become an epidemiologist overnight and claim to read public health scientific studies and understand every bit of it. That takes a lot of work to do your own research in that field, but everyone needs to read history to put the present into context. And we should all have that ability. And in reading history, I find these verses from Ecclesiastes particularly useful in coming down off the ledge. From chapter 1, verse 9, what has been will be again. What has been done will be done again. There is nothing new under the sun. I hope that helps, Molly. We've survived. We survived the election of 1800. We survived the elections of 1876. We've even survived 2016, and we're still surviving 2020, and I think we'll survive a few more. You can subscribe to Forthright by Sulani Madsen on Substack for notifications of new content. It's free for now, but I'll be launching a paid subscription option this fall with a generous discount for early subscribers. Thanks for joining me.